Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. The Hey Chaplain podcast is the place where members of the law enforcement community can share their wisdom and experience through me, the chaplain, so that they can encourage others who wear the badge. There is an entire field of investigation that focuses solely on the body of the deceased, how to identify them, and how to determine the cause and manner of death. And a lot of this work happens behind the doors of a medical examiner's office. So today we're talking to Shaun Hachinsky, the Deputy Chief Investigator at the Jackson County ME's office in Kansas City, Missouri. Shaun is going to explain not only his own job and responsibilities, but what a coroner or a medical examiner does. He'll explain why some of the deceased get an autopsy and some don't, and he'll also answer what happens to a body when it can't be identified. This episode obviously is going to be talking about death and dead bodies. Now, it's probably not bad enough to warrant a content advisory, but I want to encourage you to make a deliberate decision to stick with this episode. First of all, Shaun sheds a lot of light on the processes and procedures that a lot of us don't ever really get to see or know anything about. And secondly, I want to encourage you not to shy away from difficult topics like death. This will be informative and helpful. Here is Shaun Hachinsky. Hello, Shaun. How are you today?
Hey, Jared. I appreciate the invite.
Excellent. I'm glad you're here. So tell me, what is a medical investigator?
The medical investigator is the eyes and the ears of the forensic pathologist. We have 10 investigators on staff. We're operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Medical legal death investigator is going to answer the phone, and they're going to take that initial phone call, typically from law enforcement or a hospital, and they're going to gather information as far as the who, what, when, where, and why, determine whether a scene visit is going to be necessary. That investigator is going to go out to the scene, typically, photograph, document, interview, quite possibly make arrangements to have that body transported back to the office. They're going to write a report, begin a case folder, all in preparation for typically the following morning when the forensic pathologist is going to be able to evaluate that body and determine what steps are necessary next in order to determine that cause and manner of death.
In some cases with a natural, would the investigator be the one that makes the decision to send that body straight to a funeral home?
Typically, if there is a primary physician that's willing to sign the death certificate, a lot of times they've already been contacted by law enforcement, provided what we see on scene tends to support
that all looks pretty benign.
Looks pretty good.
Yeah.
No weapons, no suicide notes, no empty medication bottles around that don't seem to jive with how long ago they were prescribed.
Right.
Things like that, we may very well release directly to the funeral home. Otherwise, that body may come into our office, even if it is a natural death, just to confirm that it actually was a natural death.
So can you tell me, how did you get started in this line of work?
My son died in a car accident, and that was a shocker, of course. Kind of working through the grief process there, I decided to change things up. I had enough background between emergency medicine and management and a little bit of funeral involvement to pursue this field. I started as a medical legal investigator with a medical examiner's office, worked my way up to being a supervisor. I'm now the Deputy Chief of Investigations, also serve as the commander for a regional mass fatality group, as well as a federal team as a medical legal death investigator for DMORT.
Okay, so you do medical investigations for your county. You belong to a group for the entire metro that they can collaborate and work together, if there was a mass casualty event, then 5, 6, 7 counties could all get together and help one another with resources.
Correct.
And then also at the federal level, what you said, were telling me earlier, formerly that was through FEMA, but now it's through Department of Homeland Security. Is that right?
A DHHS.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so you're at every level, you're involved in, if people die in the Kansas City Metro, you're
you could say I'm fully in.
That's right. Excellent. Most people have very little awareness of how medical investigations work and who's in charge and what's important. It's usually a minor recurring character in a TV show or a movie, and that's the only exposure people have to medical investigators. So can you help me out, maybe just here at the laying the groundwork? What is the difference between a coroner and an ME, a medical examiner?
A coroner and a medical examiner have the same end goal, and that goal is to determine the cause and manner of death.
Okay.
And help families get what they need in a death certificate, which is an important document. A medical examiner is typically a forensic pathologist. It varies from state to state what certain states are going to require. There's an overarching agency called the National Association of Medical Examiners that establishes certain benchmarks of what a medical examiner's office should be comprised of. Not every medical examiner's office is name accredited, but it's kind of like one of the benchmarks for establishing some continuity across the country. A coroner could be a medical doctor, depending on the requirements of the particular state, or just whoever wants to run for election as being the coroner. A lot of times, a coroner will be a funeral director. That seems to come in pretty handy. They're already used to dealing with deceased individuals. They may have cooling capacity. They ultimately may end up handling the funeral for the family.
Sure.
Typically in smaller towns and such, they're going to know the family's first name basis.
So in the state of Missouri, the smaller, less populated counties have to have a coroner.
Correct.
Okay. And that coroner could be, it's an elected position, and that could be a doctor, or it could be a funeral director, or a dentist, or really, could it be anybody?
Anybody that can get themselves elected.
Okay. And they would be responsible for these like official documents about, a death certificate and answering the question of, how did this person die? Correct.
And if they need a higher level of expertise, for instance, an autopsy,
right,
they can contract with a medical examiner's facility that can provide an autopsy.
Right.
They typically have a budget for the year. They only have so much they can spend.
Right.
And so they have to be very cautious with their dollars.
Okay. And so a medical examiner in the Missouri context is in a larger city, in a county that has a certain population, right?
Correct.
And they at that facility are going to be able to do these investigations, which would include autopsies and other postmortem type examinations.
Right, as well as field work.
Okay. And the medical examiners are all medical doctors?
Yes, they're all forensic pathologists.
Okay. And that's probably extra years of school on top of med school, isn't it?
Correct. Med school followed by a residency, generally followed by a fellowship, and then out into the world they go.
Okay. And so you're an investigator, a medical investigator that works under an ME.
Correct.
So both the coroner and the ME, they have the same responsibility of determining a cause of death or settling that issue from the government's point of view.
Cause and manner, yes, sir.
Okay, cause and manner of death. So what are the different ways someone can die? Officially speaking.
Officially, when somebody dies, you have one of 5 choices. It's either a suicide, a homicide, an accident, undetermined, or natural.
So those are your 5 options. And conveniently, those 5 in that order spell out your name, Shaun.
Turns out to be true.
So maybe you were predestined to be in medical investigations your whole life. You didn't know it, right?
Works in mysterious ways.
So suicide, homicide, accident, undetermined, or natural.
Correct.
And the goal is to determine, what category they fall in and maybe how that happens.
The majority of deaths that occur are going to be natural. Mm-hmm. Natural deaths can be certified, i.e. a death certificate, through a private physician. If it's one of the other 4, suicide, homicide, accident, or undetermined, it has to be dealt with by a coroner or a medical examiner.
Okay, so the family doctor is not going to say, yeah, that was a homicide. They can only say, yes, this was natural.
Oddly enough, it's been known to happen, and that'll
really?
raise a lot of red flags when it gets to the state level, yes.
So your family doctor can say, yes, grandma had stage 4 cancer. We were expecting her death. She died. And you can get the certificate paperwork started. And so that process can happen relatively quickly, right? If that happens, a natural death, doctor was aware of it, she saw the doctor regularly, you can get that death certificate in a reasonable amount of time.
Right. One of my favorite death certificates was signed off as natural by a private physician, and under the underlying cause, it was trampled by cattle.
Oh, my.
Turns out that's an accident.
Yes, that sounds like an accident to me.
Unless the cow's meant to do it.
Right. That's funny. So the rest of the deaths, including accidental deaths, are something that has to be investigated. And that's where you come in. So what does an investigation look like?
Investigation typically starts with a phone call. Typically, we'll get a phone call from law enforcement if it's a death out in the field, meaning not in a hospital environment. We'll send an investigator out to the scene who will begin the process of being the eyes and the ears of the forensic pathologist. They'll photograph, they'll interview, they'll write reports, they'll gather up all the information they can. A decision will be made, depending on the circumstances, whether that body needs to be brought back to our facility or whether that body can be released directly to a funeral home.
Okay. How does that overlap with the CSI? Are they also taking pictures and doing that investigation in parallel with you? Are you working together, or do you do the job of the CSI? Tell me how that fits.
The term that you're looking for, I believe, is jurisdiction.
Okay.
When there is a death that occurs, the dead body is the jurisdiction of the medical examiner's office.
Okay.
However, the scene is the jurisdiction of the law enforcement agency.
Oh, okay.
And so we're working together. Law enforcement is trying to not mess up what is our jurisdiction.
Right.
And in turn, we're trying not to mess up what is within their jurisdiction. So we have to work together. I think that we find that most law enforcement personnel want to be cops. That's what they want to do.
Right.
They don't want to deal with dead bodies. And so they're happy to have us come along and do what we do. And we're happy to have them come along and do what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been on a scene several times with a dead body from all those different causes of death. And the CSI folks come in with their cameras when it's time to move the body because they want to take pictures under the body. They want to see what was there. Is there a weapon, or something else that's underneath the body? But that's interesting to think that from the medical examiner's point of view, you're more concerned about that body and the preservation and the investigation that's going to happen with that body than you are maybe with, the weapon that might be under them. That's
Correct.
Interesting.
Correct. And, if aspiring CSI or investigators are listening, the main difference between CSI And what we do as death investigators is death investigation usually turns over pretty quickly. We get out there when we have clearance from law enforcement. We'll remove that body, take it back to our office. The office staff, which is doctors and forensic technicians, will take over the body. Chances are that same death investigator is going to be out on another death that afternoon.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The CSI folks are going to spend a whole bunch of time scrutinizing that scene, which is their jurisdiction. So you have to have a lot of patience to do CSI. So if you're like me, you got a short attention span, death investigation is the way to go.
Is that because the body is a self-contained unit versus a scene, which may be a huge area? Why is the body take less time than the scene?
I believe that we have more control over the situation once we have the body in-house. We tend to try to turn them around pretty quickly for the family's sake, but we can take as much time as we want. A lot of times law enforcement's dealing with things like search warrants and things like that.
Every unattended death, so that's a death that's not like in a hospital or a hospice facility, every time someone dies at home or in an accident or just out in the field, do they all get autopsies? How's that determined?
No, and a lot of that's determined with the help of the death investigator. Different agencies handle investigations different ways. If it's a 98-year-old woman at home under natural circumstances, some agencies may not send an investigator at all. In our office, we try to send somebody every time. They will go out and take some photos, take some reports, interview, and figure out, does this add up to be a natural death? We're going to talk to the law enforcement on scene, possibly EMS. If everything has the appearance of being a natural death, their private physician is willing to sign the death certificate. We may very well release that body from scene. The main thing when it comes to autopsy is back to learning what the cause and manner of death is do you need to perform the physical autopsy in order to determine that? And that all comes down to the decision of the forensic pathologist that's on staff at that time. Let's say, for instance, there's a witnessed suicide, a gunshot wound to the head, through and through. That forensic pathologist may opt to not do a physical autopsy because they can safely establish cause and manner of death by doing an external examination.
Sure.
They will probably run toxicology just to see what was in the system, see if drugs or alcohol might have played a component.
And so toxicology, that's taking a sample of blood from the deceased and doing tests on it. Okay.
Now, frequently, if someone goes to a hospital in an emergent situation, the hospital, too, will take blood. They'll do some cursory looks into the system, mainly like a urine drug screen, to see what they see that is in the system. However, they don't quantify what levels are actually in the system.
Okay.
And so typically that's what we will do is we'll try to see, was what was in the system a therapeutic level, or was it possibly a level that could have caused the death itself?
Do the families get to come view the body at the morgue? That's something you see in TV shows. They pull the big drawer open and the family identifies a body. Is that something that happens?
It's very, very rare.
Oh, really?
Most facilities, by the certifications that they hold, are required to have the capability to do that, but it's very, very rare for multiple different reasons. One is just the essence of time. We may be doing 5, 6, 7 exams a day, some of them autopsies, some of them external. We don't have the time or the resources to host family members coming in, that's something better off left to the funeral homes. In addition, in the bigger city where we live, sometimes the deaths occur where there's a lot of what we all call in the business family dynamics, where we don't have the security or the capacity to try to umpire a large group of people who particularly are not happy with each other.
Yeah. And it'd be a very upsetting thing. It plays out great on TV, but it's in real life, in practice, that would be an incredibly difficult thing to manage. And I presume that there's also other ways, maybe better ways, to establish the identity of the deceased than just having a family member try to visually identify them.
Correct. We like to use scientific methods whenever we can. The first go-to is typically fingerprints, where we can run fingerprints through the crime lab and get results back pretty quickly. A second choice would be dental. Family members can provide dental information. We can get dental images electronically, submit them to what they call a forensic odontologist, who will give us an official ID by dental. We could run DNA. That's a little bit slower, although it's getting better. Worst comes to worst, you could do tattoo comparisons to photographs and such, or have family members describe some sort of detailed tattoos that we could say seems like a good fit.
Right. What happens when there's a body? I presume they usually get identified, but what happens if no one comes to claim the body? What if you don't know who to send it on to? And I mean, what happens to unclaimed bodies?
Unclaimed bodies, we typically call our long-term guests.
Okay.
They may not be claimed for a couple of reasons. One, the family may not have the wherewithal to make funeral arrangements, don't have any money. The family may not care for the person and just refuse to make funeral arrangements. Probably more the case is when we can't locate family members. And there's a certain period of time that goes by. We'll put their names up on our website and try to give people the opportunity to call in and say, I know this person, or I know his family. Worst comes to worst, the counties usually have a fund set aside to handle what these days would be a cremation. Okay.
This is the modern equivalent to like the pauper's grave. Back in the day, they just, bodies that no one claimed, they just put in the county would have like I hate to say a mass grave, but some cities probably did do that. They just didn't know what else to do with it. But now they do a cremation. Right.
These days, the only time that we would do a burial is if that body were unidentified.
Oh, really?
Yes. And it's pretty rare. Happened a few years ago where there was a guy living in a homeless camp, happened to catch his camp on fire. We went out to the camp and interviewed people that lived there. They all knew him as Kyle, although they don't think that was really his name. But to us, he was Kyle.
Okay.
And still is.
Right.
And so ultimately he was buried in a cemetery that's contracted for those. And there he remains, just in case family members ever happen to show up.
Right.
They could reclaim that body if they wanted.
Boy, what would they have to do? They'd have to maybe get a DNA match? Like they'd have to provide they'd have to be able to prove that they are his family, right?
Right. And DNA match would probably be the most accurate.
Okay.
Where we would have samples retained from him where we could do a DNA comparison.
Wow. Okay. From your point of view, what is the end goal? What are you trying to accomplish on behalf of the family?
At the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish with all of the steps that we go through during a death investigation is to get the family a death certificate. Death certificate's an important document that they need to go on with their lives after this death has occurred.
Okay. And that death certificate, you were talking to me about this earlier. It's like a bookend with the birth certificate, right? And so you need both of these documents, and you're not going to get one without the other. Is that correct?
Correct. The birth certificate begins the story, and the death certificate ends the story to a certain extent.
Okay. So if a baby dies in utero, stillborn, they're not going to get a birth certificate.
Correct.
So they're also not going to get a death certificate.
This is true.
Oh, wow. Okay. But I bet families ask for that, don't they?
They do get a certificate of fetal demise, something that the hospital will generate for them.
Okay.
But it's not the same thing as a birth certificate.
Okay. And that birth certificate and death certificate are necessary for what reasons?
Birth certificate, well, most people have birth certificates, and they're called upon to use them from time to time for certain official documentation, passports and things like that.
Right.
Death certificate is what closes out the chapter of that person's life. When it comes to adults, a lot of times you've got things like life insurance, mortgages.
Yeah, disposition of property.
Correct.
Correct. Right.
And the family members can't just go to the life insurance company and say, "Oh, Grandpa died, give me his money."
Right. They're going to want. The
insurance company's going to want something
official documents, right?
This really happened.
Right. And so we were talking earlier about the natural death. Primary doctor knew that grandma had cancer. He had been seeing her regularly. He can get that process started, and that family would get a death certificate. In our context, how quickly?
Could be within the week.
Okay, so let's say a week-ish, give or take. They have that document. Now they can talk to the insurance companies and the deal with the legal stuff and everything else. Now they have that official document. But what if somebody dies in a homicide or an accident or something else, and there needs to be an investigation? Now, what time frame are we looking at to get a death certificate?
Typical time frame could be 6 to 8 weeks.
Oh, wow.
When we're doing an investigation of a death, we didn't have that intense information about the patient that a primary physician would have. We have to learn from scratch. Starting when we were notified of the death, we may have to request medical records, interview family members. We can do toxicology and histology, studies like that get typically sent to a lab so we can see what all was in their system at the time. All of those things come to play before our doctor is going to complete that death certificate. A lot of times family members will call within 24 or 48 hours and they want to know the cause of death. The doctors typically will not issue a preliminary cause of death because they want everything in front of them before they make a final determination. They don't want to be in a position to where they have to go back later and change the answer to the family and then explain why they had to make a change.
What's been your experience interacting with the police on scene of an unattended death?
Well, one of the things that's probably the most telling when it comes to especially new investigators, if you're out driving around the city as just a layman and there's a crime scene set up and there's crime scene tape and you get interested and you want to see what's going on, they're going to shoo you away.
Right.
They're not going to let you in.
Right.
Just the opposite is when we show up on scene, they welcome us in.
Yeah.
Their area of expertise is not dead bodies, nor do they want it to be.
Right.
And so they welcome us in, and they want us to help get that scene closed up, namely so they can go on to do whatever they need to do next. We try to be respectful of the police departments and try to get out on scene as quickly as possible, get our business done. So if there's something holding up the scene from being closed, it's not us.
Right, right. Yeah, after typically when I'm on a scene, I'm away from the primary scene. I might be inside of one perimeter, but I'm not in the innermost perimeter where they're still investigating, and the CSI is doing all their work to process that scene. Once that's finished, then a lot of times the body is still there, and I will go and I'll stand with the body just like I would at a funeral, just like I would precede them from the hearse to the grave. I want to be with them and to stand with the deceased, and that's to give them, some dignity and some honor, make sure that everyone's, I'm kind of bearing witness to the process, make sure everybody's being professional and that kind of thing. And seldom do I get cops to want to stand in the room with me. Typically, they'll check outside, But I did have one here this winter where it was bitterly cold outside, and I had a whole group of cops right in the room with me. The scene was processed; it was over. We were just waiting for the body to be transported, and they all stayed right there with me. And in spite of the smells and the sights and everything else, we kept the body company. And so, so let me ask. What do you think cops don't understand about what you do?
Sometimes family members are led to believe that, one, an autopsy may be performed when it may not be performed. Mm-hmm. And the family will call and say, well, the detective told me there was going to be an autopsy, which may or may not be true.
Yeah.
Sometimes family members are upset. They hear multiple different things coming at them from multiple different directions, and they're typically grief-stricken, and so a lot of times they'll call in and we'll give them some good guidance on here's the way the process works and here's what's going to happen.
Yeah, as a chaplain, I'm talking with the family sometimes for hours. And I try to be very clear, but I try to also undo some of those promises. And I'll say, listen, there's procedures for this, and there'll be a very clear path for whether or not they might do an autopsy or do the blood toxicology or just an external examination or whatever. It's different with every case, and they'll follow all the rules, and whatever's appropriate to your loved one, they'll do that. But I was worried that some random cop is going to say, "Oh, they'll do an autopsy," and the family's not got that in their head, and they latch onto it because they're in the middle of the grief process and they're kind of in shock, and they latch on to this idea that yes, they're going to go do an autopsy here in 5 minutes, and that's not necessarily how that's going to play out.
Right. We run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For instance, if a death occurs this afternoon, there's a really good possibility that body is going to be looked at by a physician first thing tomorrow morning.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
could very well be ready for release by tomorrow afternoon.
Do you think that's a common turnaround time? Are there places that are just way too busy to do it that quickly, or is that pretty typical?
That's a common turnaround time for us because we push real hard for it. Mm-hmm. I can't really speak for other offices, but I'll tell you why it works is because you go from the time the family's been notified that this death has occurred. They've reached out to their family and friends, let them know what's happened. Mm-hmm. Typically the next day, they may make an appointment with a funeral home and try to make arrangements, call our office and let us know what funeral home they want their loved one sent to. The following day, we can contact that funeral home and have their loved one taken into their care. So they barely notice that 24-hour gap,
right,
where we're
doing the examination,
that body,
right,
and kind of in concert with that, we have unmarked vehicles. Our transport vehicles for the bodies are unmarked. We can slip in and out of a neighborhood and typically not be noticed much by the neighbors. And so that lessens the impact on the family to a certain extent. And by time they get their arrangements put together with the funeral home, the body's at the funeral home, and they can begin that funeral process.
You see a lot of death. What do you do to maintain your own wellness when you're seeing death on a regular basis?
Kind of what I explain to new investigators when they're interviewing is that by time we get on scene as a death investigator, what's happening is this is quite possibly the worst day of a family member's life. Mm-hmm. And they are not equipped to function with the situation that's going on. It's our job to go in and help them move on to that next step.
Yeah.
Next step quite possibly being funeral arrangements.
Yeah.
But we're going to go in.
You're going to find answers for them.
Find answers for them, help get that all-important death certificate issued, help get their loved one to the funeral home, and help them move on to the next stage of their life.
That provides a sense of purpose to what you do, doesn't it?
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you, Shaun. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me.
A lot of people have a problem talking about death. They don't even want to think about it. But the reality is that death is a part of life, and there is absolutely no way to avoid it. In fact, the part of ourselves that wants to avoid facing it and is scared to look at it is not the most mature part of ourselves. We must face it, and it would be good for us to be able to look at it, absorb the gravity of it, grieve it, and recover back to a functional level again. This is maturity and this is strength, and you and I can do it. So let me say thank you to the first responders and medical professionals who work around death every day. From traffic officers to homicide detectives, from social workers to chaplains, and from CSI techs to forensic pathologists. Thank you for respecting the dead and finding justice for them and their loved ones. On the next episode of Hey Chaplain. But didn't the chaplain want to serve the police department?
If you're barely showing up, and when you show up, you talk to commanders or you pray in a preachy way, you do one ride along a year, and it's a half a shift on day shift when nothing big is happening. It's report only. The cops likely aren't going to trust you. But I know people like that have amazing intentions. They're just not actually culturally competent. You can do all the PowerPoint certifications in the world. It doesn't mean you understand cops or how to talk to cops. Do you understand how cops eat, breathe, sleep, talk, socialize, and what are their views and perspectives on the world?
The views expressed here are the personal views of the hosts and our guests and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. If you like what you heard here, please share this episode with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening today. And as always, pray for peace in our city.